My name is Pat Mooney. I've been working with the etc. group or ETC group for almost 40 years now, and we've been tracking the impacts of new technologies and how they may impact marginalized peoples around the world. Especially we've been looking, of course, at the biosciences, the implications of the biosciences for marginalized peoples, but also most recently in the last 10 or 12 years, looking at so-called solutions to climate change or technologies that may be solutions to climate change.
Thank you. And could you present some information for the tribunal today with regard to this area of expertise?
Yes, we've been alarmed, I think, as we've seen the developments in the negotiations over the last several years at this rather huge gap between what governments have committed themselves to or pretend to commit themselves to here in Paris and what needs to be done in order to come remotely close to a 2-degree temperature rise by 2100. We all know that it's going to be a much higher figure than that unless something amazing happens. And that gap, of course, has been presented by governments, at least some governments in the industrialized countries, my government, Canada, as being something which can be met by a series of myths, a series of technologies that don't exist yet, that may never exist, but might someday exist and therefore at some point might be useful in resolving issues around climate change. The myths are usually described in terms of CCS, carbon capture and storage. But carbon capture and storage is the idea, again, strictly an idea, that somehow either at the smokestack or afterwards out of the air, we can suck the carbon dioxide back into the ground, bury it in a geological formation of some kind, or at the bottom of the ocean, and we'll all be safe. And of course, behind that assumption of carbon capture and storage, again, which does not exist, is the idea that therefore it's possible to overshoot. It's possible then to go ahead and pump out more fossil carbons out of the ground and use them, because don't worry, someday we'll get them back again. We'll take care of that. So we can carry on now, business as usual, continue with our economies as they are today, and not be afraid. Now, as time has gone on, this myth of carbon capture and storage has expanded a bit because people recognize it's probably not going to work, really. Maybe at 2050, in theory, it might happen, but that's unlikely. The cost is going to be at least around $2 trillion if it were to happen. The likelihood of the gases staying in the ground are rare. So with all of that, the governments and industry have gone one step further and said, well, we don't just have CCS, we also have BECCS, we have bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. In fact, they can even go one better than that, and they're now saying we can have bioenergy, carbon capture, utilization and storage. So we'll make money out of the carbon dioxide that we capture and bring back again. We'll find new industrial uses for it. And the bioenergy part, again, is to argue that through biofuels, through biosequestration in our soils, in our forests, and so on, we'll create living materials, biological materials that will absorb more carbon dioxide than they do today. That brings in an area of technologies that we've been tracking for some time. It's called synthetic biology. Synthetic biology is basically a form of extreme genetic engineering, way beyond GMOs. It's where we build the DNA, or they build the DNA, to construct the kinds of life forms they want, the kind of microbes they want, or plants or trees they would like, to claim, again, that they will be able to absorb more carbon dioxide and protect us from climate change. Again, it's a mythical technology, may never exist. Where it does exist, it seems quite hazardous to us. And we're alarmed by who's doing it as well. We're alarmed by the strategies that they're proposing. But that's how they can get by Paris, by saying that, don't worry, what governments have committed to will be matched by what industry will do in terms of this bioenergy, carbon capture, utilization, and storage.
That sounds like an awful lot of series of rationalizations. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the balance of facts on either side. You've mentioned the mythology behind these climate capture and storage technologies. Can you say something about how reliance on these mythologies is actually accelerating climate change or not?
We're alarmed by the pace of the change. I mean, at the beginning of this week, there was really no reference, or one reference was being proposed for the text that's being negotiated around net zero, or the concept of net zero, through being able to use bioenergy, carbon capture, and storage. Now we're seeing references popping up all over the place. The last count I heard was about a dozen at the end of yesterday, alluding to the possibility that this technology could be brought into play. Therefore, don't worry, be happy. Our low standards of emission controls will be matched by this technology sometime in 2030 or 2050 or further down the road. So that's accelerating. The kinds of conversations we're hearing from the corporations behind this are also accelerating about the role they can play, how helpful they can be in this area, how they just need more subsidies. They always somehow need more subsidies. And that keeps coming back. And so if we'll just help them out, get them over the hurdle of this mythical technology until where it's no longer mythical, then we'll be okay. Well, I think that's highly unlikely. It just strikes me as insane, absolutely insane, that we would leave Paris believing that companies like BP and Shell and Volkswagen actually can control emissions, can actually have a responsibility here that we would trust.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple of these companies now. Could you talk more about these perpetrators and who you believe are attacking Mother Earth in this way?
I want to say men. We don't talk enough about patriarchy sometimes in these conversations. I think Pachamama would be doing just fine if it weren't for the macho papas around. But beyond that, there are a handful of very small companies that we should be alarmed by. Companies called like Amyris and Solazyme, names you've never heard of before, who are startup companies working with synthetic biology. And it's really interesting to follow the trajectory of how they got to where they are today as being the solution to our problems here in Paris. They began by saying that don't worry, folks, we're going to create a green bioeconomy. We're going to create a second or a third generation of biofuels that will be safe and sane, that will make sure we can still eat, but we'll harvest the cellulose afterwards and turn that into fuel. Then we'll bury that fuel in the ground as well, or reuse it in some way or another. So there was the idea that somehow synthetic biology could create this other generation that would be sound and green that got them into the business. And the things that the CEOs of these companies used to say 5 years ago was, we hate fossil fuels, we're against fossil fuels, we're going to put an end to fossil fuels, we are the answer to fossil fuels. Well, it didn't work. They couldn't scale up. They actually failed one after the other. Several of them went bankrupt. And now the same companies that said they were going to be the death of fossil fuels are negotiating contracts, have negotiated contracts with the big fossil major companies to help them with what's called enhanced oil recovery or microbial enhanced hydrocarbon recovery, where they are creating the microbes. They'll be able to pump in with the fracking materials, or they will capture at source from the flared gases, using their microbes again to capture materials that they can then market and utilize in the future. So the same companies, the same individuals who are going to end the fossil economy are now actually in collaboration with Shell and Oil and Shell and BP and others to, in fact, enhance their ability to get more carbon out of the ground, more carbon fuels out of the ground. So that's the integrity that we're dealing with here in terms of these companies. That's the kind of honesty we're addressing. And they're moving ahead, and they're the ones here in Paris who are saying, don't worry, folks, you can do what you want to with your economies because we'll take care of it down the road. You can overshoot your expenditures of fossil fuels. We can't leave Paris with anyone believing that that's the answer.
I wonder if you could make a comment and open up the conversation more around the concept of net zero. I think it's important that we bring this forward, and the problems with net zero and how that affects both the idea of false climate solutions as well as how net zero is a problem for violations against Mother Earth. Thank you.
Well, net zero, again, is what lets governments pretend that it's all right to overshoot. It's okay to continue with the economy as it is today. We don't need to go to what we have to do to cut back on our emissions, because between now and 2100, we will not only be able to reduce our emissions, that's what they're saying, we will also be able to suck that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it back into the ground somewhere in hundreds or literally thousands of locations that they've identified around the world, which actually, by the way, happen to be awfully close to the mines we hate and awfully close to the oil rigs that we hate. But they'll bury it there somehow, and that will get us to net zero at the end of the day.
An additional question for you.
Yeah, you mentioned bioenergy, and can you explain how genetic engineering of trees, for an example, and that's happening in the north by U.S. Department of Agriculture's proposal as well, it's been happening in the south, how that is a violation of the Universal Declaration on Rights of Mother Earth? And then I understand carbon capture and storage is also a mechanism within carbon offsets as well. Is that correct?
Sure, it can be. I mean, in the first part, the bioenergy side ranges from everything which is practical and logical, which communities do, indigenous communities do, and farming communities do around the world now, which is often to use their own biomaterials and turn it into char and turn it into fuel. And that done at the community level is logical and practical, and it's done in the context of the ecosystems in which people live. They're going beyond that and saying, well, we can do things like we can change the photosynthesis of trees so to increase their ability to capture sunlight. We can, and this of course is not just, again, genetic engineering, it's really extreme genetic engineering. It's really building DNA to do these things in principle. They're also saying that we can find ways to bury more of it into the soil and keep it in the soil using microbes in the soil that we will invent and put into the soil. So these are all strategies that they're suggesting will allow us to have this bioenergy future that, again, is on paper in some videos here and there on YouTube, but is a long, long way from doing anything to help our environment or save our climate. And sorry, the second part of your question was, I'm sorry.
The second part of my question is related to safety protocols around genetic engineering and around the science of nanotechnology and biomimicry. Do you feel that there are adequate safety protocols that that could protect Mother Earth and the life cycles?
No, the people working in these technologies, the synthetic biology companies, claim that they're moving at 5 times the speed of Moore's law, which is, of course, the law used for computer chips and how fast and how quickly and how small things can get. And they may be right, not in terms of their knowledge, but in terms of their technical capacity. The pace of information development around synthetic biology is amazing. Every 4 to 5 months, we're seeing a doubling of their information and knowledge about management of living materials. And that's frightening to us. They are also saying that from that basis, then they will move ahead in a safe way, they believe. They're claiming their technology is safe. Doesn't everybody? Their technology is safe, and that they don't need additional regulations beyond what's available for genetically modified organisms. But this is a whole different world. We're talking about an entirely different kind of structure. We're talking about the capacity to identify specific and change, to actually edit the DNA of other systems, of living materials. We're talking about the ability to actually build living materials from the ground up. I mean, for the first time ever, frankly, God has competition. The capacity to build life from the bottom up is what these companies are claiming. And that's a threat to biological diversity, and it's a threat to our intelligence, and it's a threat to the dignity of Mother Earth.
Thank you very much, and I'm informed, unfortunately, we need to move on to the next speaker, but thank you so much for your important testimony.
Thank you.